Who doesn't like interesting stories? Those that excite from the very first minute and make you look forward to the ending to find out the answers to all questions. However, it also happens that the author at the end of the story does not reveal all the secrets, but on the contrary, leaves us shocked, wondering what happened. Such a story was Christopher Nolan's work, The Prestige. It is created in such a way as not only to confuse the viewer, but also to leave him at the end without answers, with a sense of incompleteness and a desire to watch the film again in order to catch the details. How did the director manage to wrap the viewer's finger around so that he did not understand what was going on until the last moment? And what is the secret of the final trick of Hugh Jackman's character? Welcome to the About Movies channel. Today, we will break down the twisted plot of the film The Prestige and try to understand how the mysterious Tesla machine still works. Let's go. No matter what the story is and no matter what goal it pursues, it works according to the classical laws of drama. The plot, development, and denouement are the three components inherent in any story. But not only literary works are built according to a similar scheme. The dramaturgy of the trick works in much the same way. You will first be lured, so to speak. It will throw a bait, then you will be presented with a kind of transformation. But in the end, unlike a movie or a book, a good magician will certainly leave you alone with your guesses about what just happened. Or he leaves you with faith in a miracle, if you want magic, or with disappointment, if you have solved the trick. What exactly you will leave the magician's performance with depends on The Prestige. This is the name of the third act of the drama of the trick. It is in Prestige that the difference between a story and a trick lies. It is in the third act, or rather in how it is connected with the first two. The denouement in the story should push the viewer to understand the causal relationship between everything that happened in the story that was told to him. The denouement gives us an understanding of the essence of the story itself. The trick, on the contrary, should remain a mystery. The magician's task is to make the viewer surprised, shocked, and eventually confused. The audience should never guess what the essence of the trick is. Therefore, the third act of the trick, that is, Prestige, should destroy any causal relationship between everything that happened on stage. If the viewer has solved, so to speak, the magic of the magician, then the trick has failed. The film we are talking about today is built according to the scheme of trick dramaturgy. Yes, that's why not all viewers fully understood the denouement of this picture. After all, by all the rules of the genre, the third act, that is, Prestige, should surprise and confuse. Let's figure it out together, but only if you don't mind revealing this trick. The beginning of the film The Prestige is built on the rivalry of two young and extremely ambitious illusionists who will stop at nothing to become the best in their field, and it quite falls under the definition of a thriller. But at the end, the film turns into fiction, the plot of which tells about a very wealthy lord who suffered either from his own ambitions or from an insidious scientist-engineer. The prestige of the picture lies precisely in the fact that the viewer is shocked and leaves without understanding what happened. As already mentioned, the film itself is a trick. To leave the mystery unsolved was the goal of Christopher Nolan, who in this case acted as a magician. And it is worth stating, the trick was a success. The secret is known only to the director, who, if not he, learned the main lesson of a good trick presented by Alfred Borden to a young viewer after one of the performances.
Never show anyone. They'll beg you and they'll flatter you for the secret, but as soon as you give it up, you'll be nothing to them.
Nevertheless, the film The Prestige is at the same time a fascinating story, built according to all the rules of the drama of this genre. And if you look into it without a magic component, then most likely you will guess how Nikola Tesla's invention works.
Where are the wires?
Exactly.
The main thing is not to forget that they never work as you assume, but as the scientist himself notes, this is the whole beauty of science. One of the main techniques, thanks to which it is so difficult to get to the bottom of it, is a non-linear narrative of the story. By deftly shuffling events, Christopher Nolan confuses the viewer, but to catch the essence of his treat, it is enough to arrange the story in chronological order. And now, let's check your memory. What other Nolan movie has a non-linear narrative? Write in the comments. According to the fable, Robert Angier is not a little-known magician's assistant at all, but a wealthy Lord Robert Caldlow, who will have a solid inheritance in the future. Of course, rich parents imagined their son's career somewhat differently than performing on the theater stage as a magician. Therefore, Lord Caldlow did not receive approval from them. Realizing this, he himself tries not to puzzle them with his hobby. Angier becomes his craft by working as an assistant to various illusionists. At one of them, he met his love, Julia, who soon became his wife. The girl once introduced Robert to John Cutter, a successful and very well-known creator of magic tricks to the London public. It is worth saying that the world of magicians lives quite accordingly to ordinary earthly laws. They also compete with each other and resort to various tricks to find out the secret of the opponent. It was for this purpose that Cutter once invited another assistant, Alfred Borden. Alfred, as planned by John Cutter, was supposed to reveal to him the secret of the orange trick performed by his competitor Virgil, and Borden lived up to expectations. However, the real magician in the city was the Chinese, Changlin Fu. His trick with the fish seems like a true miracle, even to the most experienced illusionists. But not to Alfred Borden, who was given the task to unravel the secret of the Chinese magician. And it wasn't difficult for Alfred to figure it out. Angier, on the contrary, like the rest of the audience, was just lost in guesses. The thing is that Changlin Fu posed as a powerless old man who found it hard to walk. It is worth noting that he did not leave this role even outside the walls of the theater. This is what allowed the magician to move around the stage with a filled aquarium between his legs, over and over again, bringing the audience to delight from the fish that appeared out of nowhere. No matter how bitter his defeat is to Angier, he honestly admits the superiority of his opponent. Borden understood right away. He tells his beloved, "But isn't it because this riddle was so easy for Borden that he himself does not portray himself all his life?" Borden carefully hides his secret in the name of the prestige of his own trick. As it turned out, Alfred does not exist. There are two twin brothers, Albert and Frederick. The brothers came up with their character and took turns transforming into him. At the same time, while one of them played the role of Alfred, the second posed as Bernard Fallon, his loyal friend and part-time engineer. The brothers came up with such a trick not only for the sake of the trick itself. Thanks to this, each of them had the opportunity at the moment of the resulting prestige to enjoy fame, feel the delight of the audience, and their genius. Let's follow their appearances to better understand the transformation of twins into their fictional collective image. So, Frederick, one might say, takes over all the fatal scenes. He gives Cutter the idea of changing the knot to a more complex one, unravels the prestige of the Chinese illusionist Changlin Fu. Seizing the opportunity, embodies his idea with a knot which leads to the tragic death of Julia, sacrificing his fingers to be no different from Albert, ruining Robert by messing up his number with pigeons, has feelings for Olivia, experiencing his own burial, pushing Sarah to commit suicide, sneaks behind the scenes to reveal Robert's prestige, but finds him allegedly drowned, accepts execution for the staged murder of Robert. At the same time, Albert meets Sarah and falls in love with her, sincerely sympathizes with Robert and comes to say goodbye to Julia, visits the exhibition of Nikola Tesla's inventions, acquires his own home for his family, was the first to see Robert's trick with transporting, and decided to give up the idea of solving Robert's prestige forever in order to stay with his daughter. And only in one thing the brothers really participate together, in the trick with transporting, which they also presented to the public for the first time. The more talented and ambitious of the brothers is Frederick. He just went to a Chinese magician's show, and he is also the creator of their perfect trick with his brother. Being fanatical in his craft, it was not difficult for Frederick to assume that Changlin Fu thinks and lives like this. Frederick saw zealous service to art, absolute self-sacrifice in the face of a Chinese magician. He saw himself in it. Indeed, for Frederick, the world was limited only to the art of illusion. The goal of his life was to come up with such a trick, the solution of which will forever remain a mystery. Frederick confidently answers to Cutter's caustic question whether he was such a trick.
Devotion to his art, not a self-sacrifice, you know?
But who believes a novice magician, albeit a very desperate one, but in vain? Of course, for Frederick, any sacrifice made in the name of a dream was natural. Frederick's desperation and infatuation also ruined Angier's beloved Julia. In a rush to improve the trick with the aquarium, he takes a risk and ties, contrary to Cutter's prohibition, a more complex knot. Julia failed and died. But it cannot be said that it was a tragedy for him. On the contrary, it was just another step on the way to his goal. But for Albert, on the contrary, the girl's death was painful. It was he who came to her funeral, sincerely regretting what had happened. Albert is telling the truth, claiming that he does not remember which of the knots was tied on that fateful day. He didn't know, because his brother was performing then. And Albert's dreams are somewhat different from Frederick's. Albert wished with all his heart to have a family and spend many happy and joyful days in its company. And it is worth saying that soon he begins to realize his desire, having met Sarah at one of the performances and having built his family with her. The transporting trick for Albert was just a means that allowed him to achieve what he wanted. However, this meant he was required to be loyal to Frederick in his plan. Albert was like Angier in his desire, because he understood his pain and despair from the loss of his beloved very well, and going to the funeral was a sincere, soulful impulse. He himself is hurt by the realization that he and his brother have taken away from Robert the meaning of his life. This is an important point, because we see that Albert is not at enmity and, in principle, does not compete with Angier. He does not wish him any harm at all, but empathizes with all his heart. Moreover, Albert sincerely repents and punishes himself for what happened. Meanwhile, Angier is going through the loss very hard and decides to take his own life. However, suicide failed, but gave birth to a new meaning of life. He firmly decided to take revenge on Alfred. Payback for the murder of his beloved became his main desire. Robert tries to find the right way to his revenge, having decided on a goal. The most obvious thing was to kill your abuser. It turned out to be a very convenient opportunity for this, because Alfred had a new trick with a gun. During the next performance, Robert, having gotten to the hall under the guise of a viewer, asked to participate in the trick and fired his bullet, prepared in advance. It was not possible to kill Alfred, but the injury was inflicted. At the same time, Robert realized that it did not become easier for him from the physical pain of the opponent. From this moment on, in the plot, we can observe three formed conscious desires of the key characters of the picture. So, Frederick, most of all, wants to do a fateful trick, the mystery of which will forever remain a secret. Robert fiercely wants to avenge the loss of his beloved, and Albert wants to acquire a fortune just to live a long and joyful life with his family. These desires are inextricably linked with each other, but differ in the object they are oriented towards. So, Albert, in order to achieve his goal, will have to make his wife Sarah happy. Frederick needs to amaze and mislead the audience. And only Robert needed to please himself. Therefore, the viewers of the movie are presented with a three-level model of conflict: internal, interpersonal, and external. Thus, Christopher Nolan embodies one of the main laws of drama in its classical representation. Another vivid example of such a conflict was created by James Cameron in the movie Titanic. If you remember, there, Kate Winslet first shows the inner conflict of her heroine. Freedom-loving Rose feels that she is in a golden cage from which she wants to get out with all her heart. However, the only possible way out for herself to get rid of the shackles of a rich future husband, she sees only suicide. She is rescued by a young artist, Jack Dawson, with whom they first struck up a friendship. Metaphorically speaking, Jack had to steal her, rescuing her from the hated golden cage. But in this case, her life is threatened by the revenge of her husband, who will find it easier to kill her than to let go. And now an external conflict takes place, where the ocean has encroached on Rose's life. The vessel on which the main character is located, even a little bit, and will go completely underwater. To resolve the external conflict, that is, to survive the crash, Rose needs to deal with the interpersonal conflict, that is, to save herself but to leave Jack at the same time. However, in order to take such a step, the main character must solve her inner conflict, namely, realize that life is possible without love. Therefore, the plot develops as follows. While the main character considers love the only important thing in her life, she changes her boat to a terrible death in the cold option with her lover. However, Jack's speech about the meaning of life, which, in his opinion, is not in love at all, but in life itself, convinces her to abandon the idea of dying with him. So Rose decides to return to the lifeboat and survive. As we can see, the wrong decisions made in the second and third acts to resolve internal and interpersonal conflicts almost led the main character to defeat in the external conflict. Nevertheless, in the third act, she came to her senses and remained alive. In this picture, Rose's conscious desire was love. However, salvation was an unconscious desire to live in spite of everything. And only after giving up the conscious desire to receive love, she was rewarded with love, although in a slightly different form. The drama of The Prestige is constructed in a similar way. At first, Robert and Albert are similar. Robert wants to be an illusionist, but meets his wife Julia. Albert also wants to become an illusionist, but meets Sarah. For a certain period, the conscious desire for these heroes was a happy family life. The only difference was that Robert was rich and he didn't have to be a magician to support his family. Albert, on the contrary, needed to earn money, and for this he had to be with Frederick, with whom they were to become successful illusionists. Robert's conscious desire became impossible after Julia's death. After a while, the same fate awaits Albert. However, while Robert can't find solace for his grief, Albert enjoys his family life. This did not go unnoticed by Robert himself, who feels that Alfred is simply living his life.
I saw happiness. Happiness that should have been mine.
In fact, only Frederick is guilty of the tragic death of both Julia and Sarah, whose meaning of life was only his desire. He dreamed so much of making the aquarium trick better that he did not stop even before the threat to the assistant's life. When the secret of his personal trick was threatened to be revealed, he sacrificed Sarah, pushing her to suicide. After all, Sarah, tired of the variability of her beloved, had the temerity to tell Frederick that she knew who he really was.
I know what you really are, Alfred. I know.
Sarah, you can't talk like this. Sarah, shut up.
Of course, driven by frantic desire, he took this as a serious threat. Frederick understood that Albert loves Sarah very much, and therefore the moment will surely come when he decides to leave his brother, finally choosing a quiet family life. In this case, Frederick will no longer have the opportunity to show his perfect performance. Of course, he couldn't let that happen. Most likely, Sarah's suicide was not Frederick's conscious action, but it fit perfectly into his life plans. Thus, Frederick in the film is the antagonist of both Robert and his brother Albert. At the same time, Robert does not even realize that Alfred is an image created by two twin brothers. For him, Alfred is Frederick, and therefore, understanding the purpose of the latter's life, Robert's conscious desire becomes to take revenge on the enemy by striking at the most painful point, to do the same trick. Thereby, he wants to destroy the prestige of the illusion with transporting invented by Alfred. The first attempt was to make a copy, but it did not bring success. Then, Robert decided to steal the trick. For that, he sent his assistant Olivia to Alfred, who was supposed to find out the secret. However, Robert was found out and deceived. Olivia brings him the desired secret, but a fake one, as a result of which he went down the wrong path. The fact is that Olivia got a fake made by Albert and not a real diary.
She must help me rid ourselves of Angier. Yes, Angier. She gave you this notebook at my request. And yes, Tesla is merely the key to my diary, not to my trick. Did you really think I'd part with my secret so easily after so much? Goodbye, Angier. May you find solace for your thwarted ambition back in your American home.
The idea was to deliberately send Robert to America, and during his absence to achieve fame as a legendary and imitable illusionist. Having achieved such stunning success, Albert would finally be able to leave this craft and just live a family life. Of course, the satisfaction of such a trick done with Angier would not have been complete if he had not found out about it himself, and therefore, on the last pages of the diary, a farewell message was left to him, in which it was told that everything written was fiction, and Olivia allegedly gave the secret at the request of Alfred. And now, if Sarah hadn't committed suicide, the picture could have had a completely different ending. In particular, Albert planned that Robert's trip would provide him with an opportunity to finally satisfy Frederick's ambitions and tell him about his decision to leave the family business for the good of his family. However, he did not have time. Sarah gave up earlier. Therefore, now Albert himself has shared Robert's fate, having tragically lost his beloved. In turn, Sarah was just another victim of Frederick. It was a sacrifice in the name of art. But for Albert, unlike Frederick, such a sacrifice is neither permissible nor justified. Therefore, it is very likely that in such a scenario, he would have taken revenge on his brother, taking his life in retaliation. In this case, he could realize his conscious desire by staying with his daughter. Besides, no one would ever figure out their trick with transporting, for sure. It would have turned out to be a wonderful drama, telling how dearly one has to pay for fame and service to art. And then it's easy to see the similarity in the development of Albert's character with the development of the Titanic's main character, Rose. See for yourself, Albert always aspired to have a family. It was his conscious desire. At first, Frederick was his family. However, the brother has his own goals, and therefore he does not pay attention to Albert's aspirations and feelings. As you remember, Rose also wanted the only thing, love. But she could not get it from her fiancé Caledon, because he was not much bothered by her feelings and experiences. Let's get back to Albert. Over time, Sarah became his family. However, for Frederick, she became a considerable problem. After all, because of her, he could lose the realization of his conscious desire altogether. Rose was also able to satisfy her desire to love by meeting a young artist. However, Rose's personal happiness was a big problem for Caledon because in that case, he would lose his coveted sense of power. In turn, the role of the iceberg from Titanic in the film The Prestige went to Robert. He, exhausted by his grief, may well sink Sarah, Albert, and Frederick. Albert managed to survive, but Sarah died after all, as Rose's lover Jack was. At the end of Titanic, Rose does everything to prevent Caledon from noticing her on the ship that saved them, thereby abandoning him. Albert is determined to sever his close relationship with his brother. In the scene where Frederick has lunch with Olivia, he looks very depressed. Olivia took it for grief for Sarah, but this is not so. Frederick is saddened by Albert's decision to end their career together. At the same time, he confesses to Olivia that he never loved Sarah, which, of course, is true.
I never loved Sarah.
Olivia, in turn, was very upset by such a revelation because she could not understand how it was possible to speak so boldly about a woman who had been a part of his life for many years.
It's inhuman to be so cold.
Therefore, despite Frederick's attempt to save their relationship, she left them. Frederick seemed to have lost everything. And probably the ending could be as we suggested earlier. Frederick tries to bring Albert back, but dies. Because for Albert, his death is the only possible solution to finally find personal happiness. And at the same time, it's the way to keep the secret forever. However, as you may remember, Christopher Nolan himself is not averse to being in glory as an unsurpassed magician. Therefore, at the end of the second act, Robert came back from America, and not just returned, but triumphantly jumped out of his oblivion into the bright London life. Angier still waited for Nikola Tesla to finish his invention, and therefore, he has something to surprise the audience with. Presenting himself in front of the audience, he honestly declares that his show is not magic, but only science.
What you're about to witness is not magic. It is purely science.
And then we got to the denouement. The fact is that 2 years have passed between the scene where Frederick categorically announces to Sarah that his life is secret, making it clear that he will never be predictable,
Sarah, secrets are my life.
and the scene where he coldly speaks about Sarah in conversation with Olivia. It is difficult for the viewer to understand this gap in time because of the non-linear narrative, which is confusing. The only thing we know for sure is that Sarah took her own life. Like Frederick, we learn all the other events in this story from Robert's diary. Yes, as it turned out, Robert also knows how to write diaries. And it should be said, he does it very successfully, because it remains only to guess whether what was written actually happened. Of course, you looked carefully, and therefore noticed that the cases described in Alfred's diary are intertwined in part with Robert's memories of those very cases, since he participated in them personally. Therefore, it is possible to talk about the reality of what happened here. But the witnesses or participants of the events from Robert's diary are not represented in the film. Frederick knows that Albert visited the Nikola Tesla exposition in search of an original and shocking design for his own trick with transporting. After all, presentation was always the brother's weak side.
He's a dreadful showman. He doesn't know how to dress it up, how to sell it.
John Cutter pays Robert's attention to this weakness. The visit to the exhibition was not in vain. The brothers purchased generators from Tesla that reproduce electrical discharges without wires for the trick. Thus, they have achieved greater popularity for their presentation. Frederick also knows that the solution of the cipher for Albert's fake diary was Nikola's last name. The cipher was supposed to reveal the secret of the brothers, but in fact it was a mockery of Robert and a way to waste his time.
Yes, Tesla is merely the key to my diary, not to my trick. Did you really think I'd part with my secret so easily after so much?
Subsequently, Albert himself draws Angier's attention in the diary that Tesla was just the key to the diary itself and not to the trick in any way. And the third fact, known for certain to Frederick, is that the scientist's invention was just a design, special effects, and not the prestige of the brothers' trick. Angier, on the other hand, returned from America with a mysterious car, which was supposedly Tesla's invention and which supposedly provided his trick with prestige. Allegedly, this machine moved Robert in space. From Robert's diary, it becomes known that the machine sort of clones anyone who gets into it. That is, during the performance, a clone was created, an absolute copy of Robert himself. The clone had the same appearance, memories, and consciousness. But it was not copying that Robert needed, but the illusion of transporting. Therefore, only one Robert had to remain. Therefore, the second one had to be killed. Here we ask you to pay attention to a significant detail. Frederick got the diary already in a prison cell. It turns out that at the moment when he made his way under the stage during the trick of his opponent, he did not even guess what he was going to see there. But the main thing in all this performance played out for Frederick, as in any trick, was a mystery, and the presentation of the trick has always been Angier's strength. And this time, he perfectly managed to make his trick mysterious. Therefore, when Robert's secret is allegedly revealed to Frederick, he willingly believes in it. Frederick's impression is enhanced by another psychological technique, skillfully used by his rival. There were elderly blind twins whom he encountered under the stage. Such a number of identical people finally convinced Frederick of the reality of cloning. In order not to have to wait for Frederick for a long time, Angier immediately limits the number of his performances.
Why? Does his method dictate that? Is it a publicity move? What is it?
There will be only 100 of them, and hits the mark. This trick puzzled Frederick very much, because it was also a kind of secret that he had to reveal. Is 100 performances to attract the public? Or is it a publicity stunt? Or is it something that Frederick can't figure out yet? The performance limit set by the opponent eventually forces Frederick to get behind the scenes. Unfortunately, this was his fatal mistake. Taking Robert's bait, Frederick allowed him to set himself up. Robert's premise was that, firstly, Alfred would be convicted and executed by hanging. As you remember, Angier does not realize that Alfred is actually a character, and in fact, he is fighting two rivals at once. So, Alfred's execution was supposed to be a long-awaited revenge for Julia and the fulfillment of Robert's conscious desire. And in addition, Alfred will die understanding that he could not realize his conscious desire to become a legendary illusionist, because his success faded because of Robert's grandiose trick. Magic became the leitmotif of the film. John Cutter talks about genuine magic when he sends young assistants to a Chinese magician for a performance.
If you want to see what it takes to make real magic, go to the Tenley. There's a Chinaman there, and he really has what it takes.
Cutter also sees magic in Tesla's mysterious machine, calling the scientist himself a wizard.
This was built by a wizard, a man who can actually do what magicians pretend to do.
Robert also talks about magic repeatedly.
Real magic.
We got people excited by Cutter's version of the trick, but imagine what we could do with the real illusion.
For Frederick, the only real way to stun the audience are magic tricks, and an outstanding trick requires outstanding sacrifices. Therefore, both other people and himself become victims. After a failed trick with a gun, Albert, as you know, lost a finger. In order not to be unmasked, Frederick inflicts the same injury on himself. Robert understands the essence of Alfred very well. Therefore, his physical death is not for him the realization of what he wants. To make Alfred suffer, Robert needs to convince him that all his sacrifices in the name of art were meaningless. There is something that Alfred cannot do. Robert's revenge will only make sense to him if Alfred believes that he can do magic. Do you remember the gap of 2 years between scenes? All this time, Robert creates an illusion, but not for the public, as it may seem, but for just one particular viewer. Alfred. Robert wants to see his facial expression at the moment he realizes the falsity. In fact, Robert's mysterious machine, although more complex, did exactly the same thing as the brothers' generators. It produced electric charges without wires. That's all. The elderly old men were doubles, and they became incredibly similar only thanks to makeup and costumes. This is the same trick that Angier did when he tried to copy the brothers' trick by hiring a drunken double as his assistant. In addition, he ordered 100 aquariums and 100 dolls, absolute copies of himself, and all this time he was practicing. However, Angier rehearsed not only the performance itself, but also, like the Chinese, everything that happened outside the walls of the theater. In particular, he trained not to breathe underwater and bribed workers at the morgue, but most importantly, he created the illusion of two events, namely his drowning and the work of a mysterious machine that allegedly creates clones. He invited Cutter to work with him to see if he would believe him. After all, Robert was sure that if he could fool Cutter, then Alfred for sure. And most importantly, he did come up with a trick that allowed him to move quickly from the stage platform to the balcony. Unfortunately, this will remain a secret for everyone, including that of the viewer. Angier always knew how to present a trick so that the audience believed in a miracle. As he admitted to the audience, there was no deception. There was only technique. It was precisely this skill that none of the brothers could boast of, and they became the main observers of the performance of Robert's whole life. They're the ones he needs to convince. And Robert succeeds here, because Frederick dies with the realization that there is something unknown to him, something magical, something more than just a good trick. It was important for Robert to see Alfred's face at the moment of his defeat. Therefore, he visits him before the execution. There is the moment of revenge. Angier created a trick, the prestige of which will forever remain a secret for everyone. Cutter, Albert, Christopher Nolan, and even for the viewers of this picture. Of course, you will not be bothered by how. After all, Angier moved to the balcony. But you remember that a trick that can be explained is considered a bad trick. For example, the trick of Frederick and Albert was immediately solved by Cutter. He insisted from the very beginning that the whole secret was in the double, and Robert stubbornly did not believe in it, considering it too simple a solution, and that's a bad trick. Robert created an illusion that cannot be explained, and that's a good trick. But if the director had given at least some hints or even an answer at all, it would have been a bad trick. Remember what Albert taught his little audience.
They'll beg you and they'll flatter you for the secret, but as soon as you give it up, you'll be nothing to them.
It is for this reason that Robert's secret is never revealed in the film. His prestige is MacGuffin. There is no cloning machine. There is only an illusion in which everyone believed, both Frederick and the viewers of the picture. In fact, there was nothing real that Robert told in his diary. It was just masterful acting. Robert played the same game with his opponents as the Chinese magician played with his audience, as well as Christopher Nolan played with you moviegoers. We ourselves are looking for complexity in where it does not exist. We allow ourselves to be deceived because we want to be deceived. However, the real prestige will forever remain known only to the magician himself. The story shown to us in the movie The Prestige ends with the death of Robert himself. Albert's unexpected appearance took him by surprise. Robert realized that his ideal revenge was about to collapse. It was possible to save the situation only if the second brother was convinced of the miracle. Therefore, Robert's last wish before his death was to make Albert look at the dolls drowned in aquariums. But Albert didn't need it.
You didn't see where you are, did you? Look.
The mystery that the aquariums hid in themselves could take his mind forever, which means he would have to give up his conscious desire to live a happy family life with his daughter. I don't care, Albert said, forever giving up the temptation to unravel Robert's prestige. We have already imagined the ending of the film, if according to the plot, Robert had not returned from his long journey. In this scenario, Albert would have to kill Frederick to fulfill his conscious desire. By and large, this is how the film ends. Only Robert was in Frederick's place. As a result, fate also did a trick with the main characters, because at the beginning of his journey, Robert was like Albert. They both wanted to have a family most of all. But at the end of the journey, Robert was destined to realize the conscious desire of his rival and abuser, to die as a legendary illusionist who created a trick whose secret no one will ever know. Is it possible to call the denouement of the story logical and reasonable? Let's trust the instinct and vision of a brilliant director. Despite the fact that not all the secrets of the film were unraveled, it is difficult not to recognize how realistic the characters and the motives of their actions turned out to be. This means that it is not so important whether all the tricks turned out to be revealed, because sometimes it is a small secret that gives meaning to what is happening. And if you like to understand the hidden meanings and unravel complex plot films, then we suggest clicking on the icon that appears on your screen. Here you will find out an interesting and slightly crazy theory about the cult movie Fight Club. Follow the link and watch. About Movies was with you. Subscribe to the channel, and don't forget, we have a lot of interesting things here. Bye-bye.